You know, a couple things. One, the COVID is not over, and COVID can continue to evolve, and it's just we have to accept that it's not over, and the risks to it can slow down growth, and that's sort of a downside risk from a growth standpoint. I would point to another
BRB
risk
boys.
is just further problems in the supply chain, which could slow down activity. And you see the situation in China as a situation there where that's their no COVID policy may cause more lockdowns, is likely to, and that may play into more problems in supply chains. In addition, there's what's going on in Eastern Europe and things like that. So there's plenty of risk out there, and we can't forget that there are risks on both sides. So that's there. That's what I would say. I know you've been all over this issue with my colleagues, Craig, on the issue of information. We don't have that information at the board, and I asked the Inspector General to do an investigation, and that is out of my hands. I am playing no role in it. I seek to play no role in it, and I can't help you here today on this issue, and I'm sorry.
Thank you. We'll go to Gina now.
Thanks for taking our questions, Chair Powell, and sorry for my tech issues. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about where your thinking on inflation stands today. You know, the last time we saw an SEP back in September, we saw that you and your colleagues were projecting that inflation would sort of sink back down quite close to target by the end of the year. And I wonder if you still think that projection from December is a reasonable one, and if your thinking has changed at all, I wonder how you're thinking about that. And I also wonder if you could talk a little bit about the pathway to getting to that deceleration. Like how do we get from here, 7% CPI, to where you expect to be at the end of the year? Where you're thinking.
So I'd say
today, the last time.
Since the December meeting, I would say that the inflation situation is about the same, but probably slightly worse. I'd be inclined to raise my own estimate of 2022 core PCE inflation, let's just go with that, by a few tenths today. But we're not writing down an SEP at this meeting, but I think it hasn't gotten better. It's probably gotten just a bit worse, and that's been the pattern. So I think if you look at the FOMC participants, there's a range there, and that range has been moving to the right for a year now. And by the way, if you look at other forecasters, essentially all other macro forecasters who do this for a living, you've seen the same pattern. So what do we think about that? Well, I think we wrote down rate increases in the December meetings, each of us individually. And I think to the extent the situation deteriorates further, our policy will have to address that. I mean, if it deteriorates meaningfully further, either in the time dimension or in the size of the inflation dimension. So that's how we're thinking about it. As I mentioned, though, I think it's part of this will be that the Fed, moving away from a very highly accommodative policy to a substantially less accommodative policy, and then over time to a policy that's not accommodative in time. I don't know when that will be. Those are the things that we're thinking about.
This guy's dodging all the questions, bro.
Another part of it is,
This man's genius.
Fiscal policy provided an impulse to growth over the last 2 years. That impulse will be less. In fact, will be negative this year. And so that's another thing. The other one is we will eventually get relief on the supply side, and the ports will be cleared up, and there will be semiconductors and things like that. Now, what we're learning is it's just taking much longer. So I think longer than expected, and that I think does raise the risk that high inflation will be more persistent. I do think we'll come off of the highs that we saw in the early part of this episode in the spring last year. But really, the question is going to be what is inflation running at, and so we'll be watching that. And our objective is to get inflation back down to 2%. It's also to provide enough support to keep the labor market healthy. The labor market is very, very strong right now. And I think that strength will continue.
Let's get some ones in the chat if you think this is positive or negative. Let's get some ones if you think this is positive for crypto. Let's get some twos if you think this is negative for crypto, man. Y'all talk to me. Let me know.
I mentioned some of the other.
Send this out to you
I
boys.
think that's what we're looking at. And
If anybody has
also,
any investments, send it out to them.
realize
They
that
need to be
the
watching
government
this
does
live
that this
right
outlook
now.
is quite uncertain, and that we're going to have to adapt, and we're going to communicate as clearly as we can, but we're going to have to be adaptable and move as appropriate.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Let's go to Colby Smith.
Thank you, Michelle. Chair Powell, when you talk about being humble and nimble about the path forward for monetary policy,
Colby.
does that also include the possibility of raising interest rates by larger increments and, say, doing a 50 basis points hike at some point if inflation does not moderate sufficiently? And should we interpret this approach as a departure from the gradual pace that we saw during the last hiking cycle?
So, as I mentioned, we have not made these decisions. We really haven't. And what I can tell you now, though, is that we fully appreciate that this is a different situation. If you look back to where we were in 2015, 16, 17, 18, when we were raising rates, inflation was...
This man did not just fall off the U.S. debt clock, bro.
Unemployment was
Bro, that shit's never going down, bro.
Rate, and growth was, in the 2 to 3% range. Right now we have inflation running substantially above 2%, and more persistently than we would like. We have growth even in forecasts, even in the somewhat reduced forecast for 2022. We still see growth substantially higher than what we estimate.
Yo, go back to the video, bro.
Growth rate, and we see a labor market.
Oh, sorry about
where, by so many measures, it is historically tight. I think the least tight aspect of it is looking at the unemployment rate, which
Sister
is
19 online.
What? Estimate of maximum employment. If you look at things like quits and job openings, as I mentioned earlier, and wages, you're seeing and just the ratio of job openings to unemployed, you're seeing a very tight labor market. Now we also know that labor force participation is significantly lower. It's a percentage point and a half lower than it was in February of 2020. Maybe a percentage point of that is retirements. Some part of those retirements are related to COVID rather than just regular retirements. So we think there is a pool of people out there who could come back into the labor force, but it's not happening very quickly, and it may continue to not happen very quickly as long as the pandemic is on. So that's how we think about that. We haven't made, to your specific question, we really have not addressed those questions, and we'll begin to address them as we move into the March meeting and meetings after that.
Let's go to Rachel.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Chair Powell, for taking our questions. I'm wondering if you can talk to us about any metrics that the Fed uses to assess how inflation affects different groups of Americans.
They're not finna tell you that.
Low-income earners. And are you worried that the Fed underestimates or can't effectively measure the impact of inflation on some of the most vulnerable households? Thank you.
So it's more a matter of, I think the problem that we're talking about here is really that people are on fixed incomes who are living paycheck to paycheck.
Right.
They're spending most or all of what they're earning on food, gasoline, rent, heating, things like that.
Heating their heating.
And so inflation right away forces people like that to make very difficult decisions. So that's really the point. I'm not aware of inflation literally falling more on different socioeconomic groups. That's not the point. The point is some people are just really in prone to suffer more. I mean, for people who are economically well off, inflation isn't good. It's bad. High inflation is bad, but they're going to be able to continue to eat, and keep their homes, and drive their cars and things like that. It's more. So that's really how I think of it. And the control inflation for the benefit of all Americans. But part of it is just that it's particularly hard on people with fixed incomes and low incomes who spend most of their income on necessities, which are experiencing high inflation in.
Thank you. Let's go to Edward Lawrence.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for taking the question here. So year over year, inflation's at 40-year high. The input costs for producer price index for all of 2021 was the highest on record. Some investors fear that the Fed might be moving too late. Now, you said no decisions were made on the path of rate hikes, but was a rate hike more than 25 basis points discussed today? And as a follow to that, because I had problems with the mute button, as a follow to that, you testified that the supply chain issues could be worked out by the end of the year. You talked about that today. The CEO of Ford, though, told Fox Business today that the chip shortage will last into 2023. So today you said inflation will start to ease this year. I want to drill down and get a timeline that you see as to when we could see that relief. Thank you.
So I would not say that I would expect the supply chain issues to be completely worked out by the end of this year. I do not expect them, and I have not expected them. What I would say, and I have been saying, is that I expect progress to be made in the second half of this year, mainly. Progress, because we're not making much progress. If you look at a ton of metrics, you can find some that suggest that delivery times are shorter and inventories in some industries moving up, but overall, we're not making progress. And things like the semiconductor issue they're going to be quite a long time. I would think they'll go more than through 2023. In terms of being too late, I would just say this: our policy needs to be positioned to address the full range of plausible outcomes, as I said, and particularly the possibility that inflation will continue to run higher more persistently than we'd expected. And we think we are positioned to make the changes in our policy to do that, and we're committed to doing that. And that's really where we are. In terms of your question about the size of rate increases, we haven't faced those decisions. We haven't made them. It's impossible to sit down here today and tell you with any confidence what the precise path will be. But as we work our way through this meeting by meeting, we are aware that this is a very different expansion, as I've said a couple times, with higher inflation, higher growth, a much stronger economy. And I think those differences are likely to be reflected in the policy that we implement.
I'm not arguing on Twitter with people about
Thank
this.
you. Let's go to Mike Nikita.
What's going on right now? Blockchain shares up 5%. Come on, man. Y'all telling me that's not bullish short term?
I'd like to sort of weave some of the strands of your answers together and ask you, as you start to reverse policy, what your goal is. Are you going to be
Very
raising
bullish.
interest rates until you get inflation to 2%? Do you want to go below 2%?
This boy on that crazy green
to
screen.
get a 2% inflation rate? And because you said we have to protect the employment part of the economy, is there some sort of circuit breaker that would stop you from raising interest rates on the employment side?
So no, there's nothing in our framework about having inflation run below 2%. So that we would do that, try to achieve that outcome. So the answer to that is no. What we're trying to do is keep inflation expectations well anchored at 2%. That's always the ultimate goal. And we do that in the service of having inflation.
Shout out to the people staking Magic though, and looks
get to
rare.
that goal by having inflation average 2% over time. And if inflation doesn't average 2% over time, then it's not clear why inflation expectations would be anchored at 2%. So that's the way we think about that. What was the last part of your question?
I was asking if you're protecting the employment side of the mandate, whether there's some sort of circuit breaker there.
Nothing like that. I mean, I would say you have a tremendously strong labor market, and you have growth this year at forecast to be well above potential. I mean, people are forecasting growth. If you think potential growth is around 2, most forecasts are significantly above that for 2022, and that's even with policy becoming substantially less accommodative. So the labor market's going to be strong for some time. we ideally what we're trying to achieve is inflation getting back down to 2%, and we're trying to do that in a process that it accomplishes, that will also leave the labor market in a very strong position. And no one really knows what that will take. Again, I would say that it isn't just monetary policy that's helping inflation get down. It'll be supply side improvements, and it'll be less fiscal impulse, in all likelihood. So, but monetary policy will do our job. It is our job to get inflation down to 2%, and a situation where the two goals can be in tension is a difficult one. But I don't really think they are here, though, because I think a really significant threat to further strengthening in the labor market in the form of higher participation over time is high inflation. And also, high inflation is taking away the benefits of some of these large wage increases that we're seeing. So we do hope to achieve, and our plan is to achieve both of those goals.
If I could follow up, does the danger of tightening too much as policy works its way into the economy with a lag mean that you should go back to being more forecast dependent in making decisions rather than the state dependency you've been using as a framework for the last year and a half or so?
Dependency was particularly around the thought that if we saw a very strong labor market, we would wait to see actual inflation before we tightened. And so that was a very state-dependent thought, because for a long time we'd been tightening on the expectation of high inflation.
They didn't say that. People talking about breaking news, the Fed votes to leave interest rates unchanged. They didn't say that. They didn't say if they're working to change it or not.
We will be clearly monitoring incoming data as well as the evolving outlook.
How are people tweeting an hour ago that they said this? The thing wasn't even live an hour ago.
Thank you for taking my question.
I think it's on Bitcoin
The
node.
benefit of hindsight, and I realize that is what it is, but do you feel that monetary policy and fiscal policy maybe did too much to react to the crisis, and that part of the inflation problem that we're having right now,
It's Bitcoin dumping.
because the government response even collectively was more than what the economy ended up needing?
Is Bitcoin really dumping?
So I think it's too soon to write that history, really.
It
what I would
is.
say is this.
Oh, but just recovered.
If you remember what it felt like at the beginning of the pandemic, literally the global
Bitcoin went to
economy
38
shut
and went to
down in large part,
36.
including
Sheesh.
our own economy, and people going to their homes for weeks on end in masks, and there are no vaccines, and it could be a really long time to get them. And you have economic activity drops by a shocking amount in one quarter. So there was a real risk of lasting damage. And I think Congress responded remarkably with the CARES Act, incredibly timely, very powerful. There'll always be flaws in these things, but in real time, it was a remarkable achievement. And we responded, and what we were able to do was, stave off a collapse of the financial system at the beginning and make time for what really needed to happen, which was the income replacement and then the recovery that Congress enabled.
Yeah,
with the
these
CARES Act.
I don't know.
Now that was a lot.
Prices did dip a little
That was
bit,
a lot.
boys.
And what we did was a lot.
Coin market cap.
So what we have now is we have the strongest recovery of any country, and we have a recovery that looks completely unlike other recoveries that we've had, because we've put so much support behind the recovery, and we're managing the relatively high class problems that come with that, which are high inflation and a labor shortage. So, and these are serious problems, very serious problems that we're working as hard as we can on. Was it too much? Again, I'm going to leave that to the historians.
They don't have the DEX tools for
25 years,
Bitcoin?
We'll look back at this incident, which will be a 2, 3, 4, 5 year period, and we'll say, we'll have a much better basis to make a judgment about the actions that people took. But it was all founded, though, in a very strong reaction to a unique historical event, and I guess I'll have to leave it at that. I look
Bitcoin
forward
up
I'll be
1%.
around to see how that
It
looks.
did drop a little bit because it kicked up, but I mean, it's not gone.
Thank you. Let's go to Gene Young.
Let's see my favorite one. Let's go check my favorite one, boys.
Thanks, Michelle.
2,500.
Some investors are expecting the yield curve could flatten or even invert after rate hikes begin. Would that worry you? And how important is that risk in the Fed's consideration for adjusting policy?
So we do monitor the slope of the yield curve, but we don't control the slope of the yield curve. Many factors influence longer-term interest rates, but it is something that we watch, and you will know that from when we had this issue a few years ago. And we take it into account along with many other financial conditions as we try to assess the implications of all those conditions for the economic outlook. So that's one thing I would say. Another is currently you've got a slope, if you think about 2s to 10s, two-year Treasury to 10-year Treasury, I think that's around 75 basis points. That's well within the range of a normal yield curve slope. So it's something we're monitoring.
Still looking pretty good, boy. Still looking
We don't
pretty
think
good.
of it as, I don't think of it as some kind of an iron law, but we do look at it and try to understand the
They say
implications and
it
what
went
it's
down
telling us.
5% to
It's one of many
3,400.
things that we monitor.
And I can follow up
Coinbase.
real quick and ask, if it did invert, would you tie it to U.S. fundamentals, or would it be driven by
Markets
a much
appear not to love this
broader
tone
set
so
of
far.
factors?
You can say much of anything,
That's a
though.
good
He won't
question
speak
in
again
real
to
time.
March. Everyone's going to take a look up
Obviously,
buy
U.S.
anything. Seems
long-term
unlikely.
sovereign debt is an important global asset, and the fact that our rates are so much higher than other risk-free sovereign rates around the world may put something of a ceiling on our rates. I don't know, but it would really depend on the facts and circumstances at that time.
I don't.
Thank you. Let's go to Brian Chung for the last question.
I don't.
Chairman Powell, Brian Chung, Yahoo Finance. Within the context of just the broad effort to normalize rates, would you describe what you want to do as a gradual hiking? And then secondly, within the context of hiking cycles, it's often the talking point for financial stability and wanting to make sure that asset bubbles don't merge. Is that something that has also factored into the conversation as you start to think about hiking rates? Thanks.
I would describe what we're doing.
That dude
along
had the
these lines.
J's in the back.
This is going to be a year in which we move steadily away
I
from the
missed
very
it.
highly accommodative monetary policy that we put in place to deal with the economic effects of the pandemic.
Oh, okay, now
It's going to
Bitcoin's
involve
down.
a number of things. It's going to involve
Oh, now
does
Bitcoin's
involve
up.
finishing asset purchases. It's going to involve lifting off,
Bitcoin is down. No,
and it's going
Bitcoin
to
is up.
involve
No,
additional
Bitcoin is
rate
down. No,
increases
Bitcoin
as
is up.
appropriate. And we're going to write down in March our next assessment of what that might be. It's going to continue to evolve as the data evolve. We need to be quite adaptable, I think,
Still up
in
1%
our
though.
understanding of this.
Even with that
The
being,
last thing we're going to do
with
is
it
we're
just
going
changing,
to have a couple more meetings, I think, to
it just
talk
went
about
up 2%. Like, come on, bro.
allowing the balance sheet to begin to run
This is
off
looking good. This is looking good.
and do so in a predictable manner. And
good, boys.
that's
Looking
something
good, boys.
that we will also be doing as appropriate. And I wouldn't, I don't think it's possible to say exactly how this is going to go, and we're going to need to be, as I've mentioned, nimble about this. And the economy is quite different this time. I've said this several times now. The economy is quite different. It's stronger. Inflation is higher. The labor market is much stronger than it was. And growth is above trend, even this year, let alone last year. So all of those things are going to go into our thinking as we make monetary policy. And you asked about financial concerns in connection with our policy. Was that your question?
Yeah, within the context of other hiking cycles, it seems like worries about asset bubbles emerging as a result of easy rates has been part of that. I didn't know if that was part of the discussion today.
I would just say this. We of course have a financial stability framework, and what it shows is a number of positive aspects of financial stability. But you mentioned really asset prices is one of the four. So asset prices are somewhat elevated, and they reflect a high risk appetite and that sort of thing. I don't really think asset prices themselves represent a significant threat to financial stability, and that's because households are in good shape financially than they have been. Businesses are in good shape financially. Defaults on business loans are low and that kind of thing. The banks are highly capitalized with high liquidity and quite resilient and strong. There are some concerns in the non-bank financial sector still around money market funds, although the SEC is has made some very positive proposals there. And we also saw some things in the Treasury market during the acute phase of the crisis, which we're looking at ways to address. But overall, the financial stability vulnerabilities are manageable. I would say.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Why do you have an OnlyFans email in there?
Yeah, let's see.
You see it?
Where, huh?
You see it?
Why are you
Oh, shit, I
fucking
see it
going?
too.
You're going to Dubai, motherfucker?
Yeah.